Hello? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for joining this last panel of the symposium. It's not the last inputs. We'll be hearing from Beatriz and also Lydia and Areti a little bit later. But in the words of Vanessa Williams in her 90s R&B song, we went and saved the best for last. So here we are to discuss Farm and the Species. Before I kick off, although Areti and Lydia are not here, but Ivan was, I think that we should all give a huge round of applause to Lydia, Areti, and Ivan. They've been thanking a lot of people up until now, and so I would like us to take the opportunity to thank them. So. Thank you very much. So this being said, welcome to Farm and the Species. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to how I see, or what are some of the challenges that I see in relationship to this today, and also thinking a little bit about what we've heard up until now. So urbanization, as we know today, represents one of the main threats to fine ecological balances. It's also home to the majority of citizens across the globe, but also a plethora of fauna and flora, as well as different technologies and cultures. Cities are growing at an incredibly fast pace, creating ever-growing risks for ecology, which is responsible, in turn, at multiple levels for the health of the citizens inhabiting these spaces, as well as the planet in general. In this sense, urbanized areas, among which farms and consequently their design and planning, become key in addressing such issues in order to maintain the well-being of all living and non-living systems. The approaches developed are often designed to counteract the impacts of anthropogenic pressures on the ecology, rather than empowering ecology to actively adapt within today's highly urbanized world, becoming an active partner within the definition of this transition. Within the realm of spatial design, this condition raises the question, or the essential question, of how nature and ecology and all of its species can there too have an active role. To this end, concepts such as renaturing or rewilding, both intended not only to restore nature, but allow it to thrive independently, offer an unprecedented challenge for designers to approach landscape, in whichever of its forms, under a dynamic, collective, multidisciplinary, and multi-scalar perspective. Whether by the development of tools and technologies to understand and interact together with our environment, or understanding how we can give back to the environment beyond mere mitigation. Whether by the identification of keystone animal species as landscape constructors or instigators, or the development of new spaces for multi-species habitats. The approaches, projects, and research that we will see here today have the potential to empower designers with a set of new elements to understand, represent, and create landscapes that embed nature as an active partner, functioning together with a multitude of species, not only plants, animals, and among which, of course, people, but also technological and cultural species, and producing for this multitude of species. In doing so, they reconsider the polarization between the environmental, technological, cultural, and anthropocentric forces, providing an opportunity to consciously design for and within climate change adaptation. To start us off in this multi-species journey, it is a huge pleasure for me to welcome my dear friend and colleague, Jonathan Minchin. John is a multidisciplinary architectural designer and maker, working between the built environment, digital fabrication, and with a particular focus on rural contexts. He founded the Green Fab Lab at Valdaura's Yax Valdaura Labs in 2013, and is currently the project manager of several EU projects, among which the Climate Resilience Agriculture and Robotics for Micro Farms. He also runs a fantastic farm in Benifayet. John will start us off sharing tools for the observation and practice in ecological design. Please help me welcome him.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Mathilde, and to the organizers as well for the invitation to be here. And I'm very excited to continue the discussion from the last panel which raised some really interesting points that I hope we can bridge to and perhaps begin to formulate some answers. So for this topic, I would like to talk about observation and practice in ecological design. And for me, this very much works with a longer research of how do we involve ecological indicators as the drivers of our designs and of our technology choices. So to do that, I'm going to talk about a very personal and practical experience that I've had over the past 10, 15 years. So what you see there in the middle is the Vaidaura Labs campus, part of the EAC community, and it's just outside Barcelona in the hills of the Collserola. I also work in the Taipei Urban Gardens, which is a converted baseball stadium in the center of the city. And I also live and work on a farm of 10 hectares in the south of Catalonia. So this is a very involved living experience of working on a farm as a farmer and also working with innovation. So for me, just a few points and observations as we go through. But when we look at the concept of the edge, this is an ecological concept, and it's really what I think that is one of the most important zones of study. So here you see the Mediterranean, where the sea hits the land. It's a place where the city is touching the forest. And it's also where you have a real history being pushed forward in terms of innovation. So these are intersections, these are collisions of biomes, and it's always in these collision zones that you begin to find inspiration for innovation and emergence of species. Another concept away from space is that of time. And I think when we're really trying to look for innovation or change, we need to be able to absorb and try and embed a cognizance of change. And that sort of baseline, where do we take our understanding of ecology from? Is it 10 years ago? Is it 10,000 years ago? So just to highlight this, there is Vaidaura Labs, and you see those wonderful oak trees, the white and the holm oak, and we look at that and we think that that is nature. But in a real sense, that is only the nature of now. The term of Vaidaura, the place of Vaidaura, means Valley of the Laurels, Vall del Laurel. But you don't find that many laurels there now, and that is because of the human intervention onto the land. So that natural succession has changed because of our interaction. In a very modern sense, and we touched upon this in the previous discussion, what is it to work with nature, and where are we trying to go? So in a real sense, this is a shift from the industrial optima to the ecological optima. And to do this, this is moving from specialization of monocultures into a diverse and a polyculture practice. But what we also see is that change of scale, which is moving from a massive, large scale of cultivation or farming to a very small scale. But also you can see the complexity change, but you also see the position of the farmer's back. The tools need to change also. So when we think about scale, we think about place, we think about context. These farms, let's take this one in Brooklyn Grange that we know about, is a polyculture farm, but it embraces a whole sense of diversity. Actually, through the market studies that we've done with the European Commission, what we've discovered is more than 50% of registered farms in Europe are actually polyculture micro farms. And a micro farm is a European term for a farm less than 5 hectares. This is interesting if we do want to make that transition to a sustainable farming, to try and embed an ecology in that would also mean a drop in production over time. And what is the reason for that? Is because we would have to wait for the trees to grow. We don't have the techniques nor the technologies to be able to farm in such a complex way. So this 7-layer of farming system is possible on the small scale, but very difficult to manage once you start to scale that up. So it does beg the question, working with nature and not against it, is it easier? And I would say no, it is not. Diversity is inherently complex, and dealing with that complexity is what we must face. So when, again, looking at Weidauder, and we're taking this from very much a human perspective, trying to promote an abundance of difference, it's the same idea. What we see is potentially not what plants or other species want. So asking the question, what do other species want? When we look at that, we see green. But green is the only part of the visible spectrum that plants actually reflect, and that is why we see them as green. But what do plants want in this way? We don't know. We need to accept a loss of control and to embrace the unknown. And in that way, I think we can only begin to start to work with an ecology of complexity and to be able to afford an ecological optima. How to do this? I think working in terms of botany, I would turn to the work of E.O. Wilson, the late E.O. Wilson, who came up with this idea of consilience, a literal jumping together of disciplines and knowledge, and trying to form a convergence through empirical study as well. So for me, when working at Weidauder and trying to create a material circular economy within the site, that really does mean starting at primary resources. How do we begin to grow nutrients, grow materials, and start way back in the industrial line before we can start to adapt to a new future? So that means looking at biology, agrology, forestry, before fabrication, before design. And so this is observation. How do we, as designers, as innovators, as engineers, become cognizant of biotic function before we start in our design process? So there's new tools, there's new lenses, and I'm very interested to work with those lenses as a way to inform the design process. So this may be scanning, it may be working with digital tools for mapping of mutualisms and creating associative patterns. But again, data is not information, and information certainly is not wisdom. And wisdom, in my sense of it, is not practice. I think it's very important to get our hands dirty, and in that way, we can observe change by engagement. These are some of the workshops conducted at Weidauder across the board, and they are all tacit, empirical learning by doing. If you want to be a beekeeper, you have to get to know the bees. And the longer you do that, the more that you see change. So we can't do these things without observation. To deal with constant change, we need to be messy and adaptive. And we need to create tools which respond to messiness in this way, the unexpected. I'm going to go quite fast here, but towards a computational agriculture, a computational agroecology. So this is where I think computation and agroecology meet quite so well. Let's take the work of Masanobu Fukuoka from Japan, and he's talking about do-nothing farming. Let nature do the work. And when we look at Larry Wall and his philosophy, the inventor of Perl language, they agree that we should be lazy. We should slow down, stop, and observe more, optimizing the conditions to do as little as possible. So for me, in a design sense, this means working with computation of plant layouts. What does it mean to create a farm where there are no rows? What does it mean to create a garden bed where each of the plants afford the nutrients, create the cycle for the next, offer protection? Well, this makes things very, very complex, but we can be supported by some new tools. Okay, so last little run is 2 existing projects. So robotics for microfarms. This is creating open source machine learning tools that can work in the field for farming communities. So these can be adapted to working on the farm, to doing many, many complex and menial tasks, but also this affords a more complex environment. So it's not trying to make things easier, it's trying to make things harder, because we can do that with the power of ecology. This might be the scanning and phenotyping of plants. We've never been able to do this in the farm before, but if we are able to scan, we can begin to even segment and understand angles of leaves, of organs in the field in a live way. This is farming data, but it's farming down to the micro part of these plants. And to do that in context as well. So also referencing to the terroirs and these microclimate environments. What might we plant to improve the soil? Last little sprint on these projects is we don't only have to see things in different spectra, but we can also hear. So what does it mean to listen to another species? Well, in this sense, the open source Beehive project allows us to download and customize and change the shape of a beehive. We can fabricate and customize those things to suit local environments or materials. But we can also monitor. And in this way, what does that mean? It's not just an understanding of temperature and humidity, but we're actually looking for signatures, sound signatures that are coming from the hive. The queen is often shouting and telling us what we need to do. Being British, I do understand what the queen said. So in this sense, we're really looking for these signatures that came from the hive, and we're beginning to learn new languages and behaviors and be able to respond to that with our design and our practice. To do this, we need more ways to interoperate. So bringing environments together with species, together with needs. In that way, we can produce innovation. And this is a very long-term project of creating digital and distributed networks of designers with regional similarities. So how can we learn from each other, from the environments in which we live? Finally, I invite you to my home. This is my small, humble home in the south of Catalonia with a wonderful view. And I invite you to come and join me to be a constant gardener in an environment of perpetual change, but definitely to get your hands dirty. Thank you very much.
So thanks so much, Jonathan. If anyone's interested to visit him in Benifayet, I suggest you don't let him run out of the room before you get the actual address. Our next speaker is the one, the only, Joachim. He's a co-founder of Terreform 1 and associate professor of practice at the New York University. Formerly, he was an architect at the offices of Frank Gehry and Yao-Ming Pei. He has been awarded a Fulbright scholarship and fellowships with TED, Moshe Safdie, and the Martin Society for Sustainability at the MIT. He was chosen by Wired magazine for the Smart List and selected by Rolling Stone for the 100 people who are changing America. His design work has been exhibited at MoMA and the Venice Biennale. So when I asked Mitch for a one-liner on what he would be presenting today, he gave me this. My topic is rice. Yep, just yummy rice. So get out your appetite and help me welcome Mitch.
Super good to be here. It is an amazing show. Big thanks to the curators, Rati and Lydia. It is absolutely fabulous. The work there is amazing. I'm going to show our contribution, which is a micro exercise in research on rice, but all the other projects are just thrilling. And I don't say that easily. I kind of hate everything, so that's something that I actually think that this is a pretty phenomenal show. So we are Terreform One. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. No one owns it. You could start one here if you wanted to. We think together on topics that are usually wicked problems, especially around climate change, which is an issue that's not easy to solve, and we better get there. Our mission is design against extinction. So just need to do a little bit more than sustainable architecture and green design, which is good. We think that this is the key problem. All the work that we're doing involves another species or organism. It's not really human clients. Our clients are things that don't have a voice. And we also get deeply worried about things like this, such as extinction of species like the white rhino. Another project that we did is about the monarch butterfly. This was for the Cooper Hewitt. Our client was this beautiful, amazing creature native to New York City. When we started this project 5 years ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had said this was an at-risk species. It's very hard to count them. In fact, within that year, 90 million had disappeared. Now, as of last month, they are officially endangered. You probably won't see the monarch butterfly in your lifetime. My kids won't either. Like the bald eagle, they're almost gone. It's probably, it's a crime to kill one. Although we don't go out and kill butterflies. It's the things that we do. It's development. It's the practice of architecture. It is not necessarily directly, it's not just us, but it's how we treat the landscape. The problem is systemic, and that, unfortunately, has hit that organism hard. Every 7 minutes, we lose another creature on this planet. So we designed a sanctuary for monarch butterflies. That's a system, a facade system that fits into a building that's there to give them a chance to jumpstart their populations. And we did this a few years ago. Another project of ours looks at mealworms. These are kind of fun to eat. 80% of the world eats insects. In Europe and the United States, we really don't, at least not purposely. They're usually contaminants in our food. Here we're looking at, we do an insect thing later, but here we're looking at insects that eat our waste. So this is mealworms that devour styrofoam. We did this project with the Bloomberg Foundation in a place called Camden, New Jersey, which is a really indigenous population. Difficult group, and we wanted to show them that urban junk spaces could be solved by having mealworms eat styrofoam e-waste. So you dump your waste in there and the mealworms eat it. We also produced a farm for mealworms. They were our clients. Looked at everything from their life cycle, their frass production, how they propagate, and make sure that they can eat that styrofoam and make sure that they're happy doing it. That's tough to find out with various clients that are insects. Another effort that we looked at was research into eating crickets. So here's an alternate form of protein you can produce inside cities, not livestock far away, but they're inside cities. It can replace cows, pigs, chicken, lamb. It's got the same amino acid structure. It's 300 times less greenhouse gas emissions, 2,000 gallons less water for the same gram of protein if you can eat a cricket. Now, I can't eat them because they're a little scary, but if you powderize them and turn them into bagels, pasta, bonbons, they're fantastic to eat. They can taste really good, and you do your part for climate. So that's yet another project we had worked on, this super sanitary, hygienic environment designed for the crickets. And then another kind of background project to what we've been up to. This was the urban farm pod or plug-in ecology. It is farming inside your home using cellular agronomy, where you want to get high yield crops, not stuff like corn and wheat, which you can do in big fields, but stuff you want to have fresh and local and immediate. Arugula, wheatgrass, different types of mints that you'd put into your salad. So when we were approached to do this project, here for the Biennale, we were given this sort of assignment of digestion and lounge. I think that was it. It sounded very Greek, surprisingly enough. And we were like, okay, so we want to do rice and something for facades. And it changed a number of times, as it should. And the concept is also still evolving. So, forgive me if some parts of the theoretical aspect of it isn't quite there yet. But what we got by taking rice as a client from a single grain and its various operations and growth patterns and nutrient structures and carbon loading in the atmosphere to a series of data sets and rice as data and architecture produced on these scaffolds to let us unpack information about this powerful food substance. So what's great about rice is that basically 45% of all of us eat rice every day. Almost 4 billion people consume rice every day. And then it passes through our system and goes back into the earth, and then we consume it again. It's also something that grows on every single continent except Antarctica. And that's another powerful thing about rice. It's been cultivated for more than 9,000 years. Since basically the beginning of agriculture, rice has been there. What does that all mean? And then there's new technologies about rice, such as it's been engineered to grow in salt water. And there's other concepts on how we could make it greener, because it has an enormous impact on the environment. And rice, if you want to talk about plant-based architecture, it's been around for at least 2,000 years doing its job. Here in the Great Wall of China, guess what? Most of the mortar since the Ming Dynasty was made with rice, also lime and blood. I guess they were busy stabbing pigs and, I don't know, oxen and slaves and mixing it into the mortar, producing a wall that lasted forever. I got contractors that, say the stuff that they're putting in my building the last 20 years. This is a 2,000-year architectural product. It's still pretty valid. A lot of new research is happening on it. This is an actual wall in Nanjing made from rice mortar. So we looked at many types of rice. There's too many to discuss, but the main ones are red, black, and white. A majority of the various types of rice varieties that come from different stalks, 71% of it is white rice. So we created these informatic models, these maquettes, for this micro-research project that are divided up based on those exact stats. So this one is consumption, where you can clearly see the differences between the consumption of red, black, and white rice, around 71%, et cetera, is built into the scaffolding system of those models. We also looked at the impact, the environmental impact of rice across the world. So methane gas production, 27% of that comes from rice. That's an enormous impact on the environment, especially with greenhouse gas emissions. We can do better, and we looked into research on how to grow rice that doesn't have the same methane gas production. It also does a lot with fresh water, around 9% of all agriculture, including anything that has to do with farming or cattle. So this particular system here, this model, was very much about those impacts, and we captured that in these Boolean operations, subtracting it from the main rice grid to show those differences in the impact model. And finally, there's balance. Balance is the model that we looked at where we considered what can we do to make a difference, or what has been done. A lot of it has to do with farming systems. Upland is much better than flooded versions. There is a lot of off-gassing due to fertilizers being exposed to the stalks and flooding and irrigation problems. All of that could eventually look into a model from saving fresh water to greenhouse gas emissions to different types of fertilizers. We could reduce rice's impact by 45% globally. These are the different maquettes as they are together in this different suite, from consumption to impact to balance. We actually love the kind of visualization of it. We worked very hard to build a system, a kind of a tectonic, to make it work architecturally at some level. And we sort of designed a kind of a rice brick. We got very Louis Kahn, what does the rice want to be? I don't know, but we got there so far. We used a lot of rice in the process. 15 bags of rice, 450 pounds of this stuff was made. We had 7 people working on it for a couple of months. Not all of them were happy. We started off doing different material studies and failures. We got algae growth on top of it, or microbial growth on top of it that killed many of the early studies that we did. Also frying it and puffing it. Hard to do, but once you do something like that and you do it sustainably, it has a 30-year shelf life. Rice is pretty great. We wanted to combine storage and nutrient as one system, not separate those two, and that makes it easier for distribution. We looked at different ways of mixing rice and producing rice paste, because we wanted no distinction between mortar and brick. They are the same in this case to produce this matrice. A lot of it was drying sheets and large scales of drying sheets. And then finally, production of these rice voxels, which have the intense density of all of those nutrients compact in the most usable module. If you get too small, they don't work. If you get too big, you get issues of lack of tensile strength and shearing, and they don't quite work, barely at around a brick size. It's somewhere in a sort of a bite-size element where they become the most efficient system to work with. Then we assembled them, placed them inside our grid system based on the informatics that we worked on, and then arrived at these kind of final positions, which are not final by any means, but where I'll leave off for more of the discussion. We looked at a pile of rice, and similar to Gordon Matta Clark, a pile of anything becomes art, but it wasn't really satisfying, even though it's very easy to allow gravity to do its thing with rice. We then looked at the most anal retentive version of what we can do with rice, which is printing them in precise, compact angles, each and every grain, into these perfectly formed voxel modules, which made some of us happy, but wasn't realistic because it didn't consider the mortar. So the final one, the matrix variant, we look at rice itself as a paste system, very easy to produce with just a modicum of water, a little bit of salt for preservation, and then the actual grains themselves placed together, and you get this very usable voxel-like module that you can build into an architecture. For us, it was intended to not only think about not only explaining what rice does, but to add them to buildings to jumpstart rewilding in cities. Allow them to coat different surfaces in an urban area so all kinds of things can feed on them. The stuff of life can thrive and get a chance to live, whether it's, rats or pigeons or all types of insects, maybe some humans, didn't matter, but we wanted a system that was ephemeral, temporary, and filled and rich with nutrients. Anyway, that's some of our work on rice. Thank you very much for listening. Go sit down.
Thanks very much, Mitch. For our next speaker, Pedro Gadahno, zero is not enough. Pedro is an architect, curator, and writer. As 2020 Loeb Fellow from the Harvard University, he was a curator of the contemporary architecture at the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Between 2015 and 2019, he was the founding director of the MAT Museum in Lisbon, where he initiated more than 50 exhibitions, curating new commissions, as well as major interdisciplinary shows and publications. His latest book is Climate Change: How Architecture Must Transform in the Age of Economic Emergency. To take us from zero architecture that must now be more than sustainable or passive, to an architecture that now needs to actively deliver energy, negative emissions, food, and ecosystem services. Please help me welcome Pedro.
Is this the green thing? Hello, and thank you for having me here. 20 years after my the first time I was in Tallinn to see this amazing transformation, but also to participate in an event that I think makes me very happy in the sense that only 2-3 years ago I was kind of anxious that climate change was not being addressed by the education system in architecture or even the curatorial system in the art and architecture world. And I can see that 2 years after, everything has turned into the direction of climate. And this is, of course, excellent and fantastic, because we do need a massive change. And we have talked about change over these few lectures recently. And that's also what my book is about. And that's what I want to talk about here. How can we actually produce and start that change? And of course, seeing so many work in this biennial, like also at the Oslo Biennial 3 years ago and other recent events, both in the art and architecture world, I think it's wonderful that we can harness the creative energy of students to come up with new ideas. I think it's fantastic that people like Terreform are exploring for a number of years now all the possibilities, all the different pathways, as I call it, to actually start that change. But my question is, are we keeping it in a sort of academic and professional bubble? And how can we burst that bubble and actually make that change go into the profession at a larger scale? And of course, there you have to have clients, you have to have markets, you have to have policy driving that change in the sense of architects embracing those possibilities and those pathways. But of course, we also have to know what we're talking about. And one thing that concerns me, and I would say it's transversal to many fields, including the scientific field, is the fact that people are looking at very particular aspects of the major problem, and they are getting very specialized, as we mentioned yesterday, about certain topics there, but then they're losing the bigger picture and what is really happening that impacts our practices, both scientific, architectural, or others. And so one of the things that I found most amazing along this symposium was that the word decarbonization was used perhaps one time or two times. And if we put two fields together that we are discussing here, the built environment and the agro-food systems, we are talking about the two sectors responsible for 69% of carbon emissions around the globe. 38% in the built sector, in the building sector, and 31% in the agro-food system. So basically, what we should be discussing is actually how are we to contribute towards that massive change, which is to decarbonize those two sectors from here to, people say, politicians say gladly, and of course completely diluted, till 2050. I mean, scientists say the mission is impossible, as we have heard here as well about, producing food in cities to make themselves sufficient. So the task is apparently possible. But I do believe that we have in our hands already a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of practices that point in the right direction. So now, perhaps we really should, in terms of the education system, in terms of the curatorial system that is spreading knowledge and information, we really should be talking about the elephant in the room. That way in which we can actually produce decarbonization. How can we upscale those small experiments that we are talking about here to really become market forces that change the way we are doing things? Because let's face it, one interesting aspect of the first resource war, as I like to call it, although it's the second, it's not the Syrian war, it's the Ukrainian war, it's a war about energy, as you know. It's a war about food, cereals, but it's also a war about fertilizers. And the fact that most of the fertilizers around the world come from those two countries. And now we have a crisis next year in Latin America because fertilizers are not arriving to produce the food that is needed to feed the whole population over the next year. So we'll be hearing about that soon in the news, but perhaps first, we should really think about what is behind the scenes and what is driving these major ecological change or emergency, as I call it in the book. And what the book tries to do is really to create a context both inside and outside the discipline by looking at aspects like whatever happened to the environmental avant-garde of the 1970s when a similar crisis of 1973 really produced incredible thinking in the field of architecture towards a more ecological architecture that then bluntly failed because, of course, the technology was not yet available, as it is today, actually, to produce those ideas and to make them scalable and to make them part of the mainstream production of architecture. Because let's face it, what we're talking about here is fringe production. And the question is, how long will it take to get into the mainstream? This is the basic idea, because it may be too late in 10, 20 years to have those solutions spread out into the whole of the market. So that's why change is so urgent, and that's why a part of the book is precisely concerned with the social and political mechanisms of how this kind of change can start. And as we have discussed here, it will not be on an individual basis, it will be on a political basis, and people ultimately say that the way you can drive change is voting for the right politicians, because that's the only way things will start to change in a way that then will influence the practice of architecture through policy. There's another way, which is emergency. As soon as the crisis is so catastrophic, of course, policy will start pushing people into action. And we were discussing this earlier. I believe that's one of the ways in which change will actually happen in a very Marxist way, like Philippe was addressing yesterday as well, which is the fact that reality will force change onto people. But even then, we must know what we talk about. And I think for us to produce the kind of change that is required, we have to think about the scale of the modernist movement beginning and altering the way we produce architecture, and think about it by 100 times in terms of speed and in terms of dimension of change. But what we can learn from early modernists is the fact that over 10 years, with a lot of propaganda and some nice takes on how to aestheticize new materials, they actually changed the world. You know, Corbusier, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, they changed the world of architecture in about 20 years. So I think now we can emulate that sort of capacity to change the field and really move towards a new direction. Because, of course, what these people did as well was promoting the materials that now we see as the weapons of ecocide. The fact that concrete is responsible alone for 8% of emissions around the globe tells us that we can no longer aestheticize concrete as the material of choice to express our architectural likes. So that means that we really have to go into alternative materials, alternative ways of building, and much more. And in fact, embark in what scientists call the Great Transition, which is basically changing our ways of life over the next 30 years. And this is what I think the field of architecture can contribute towards in effective and important ways. But we really have to understand the context and what we're talking about. What I think is interesting from the political aspect at this very moment is the fact that people in Europe, for instance, they expect to overcome this crisis just by receiving a 300 euro check from the government to cover their energetic needs for the next few months. They don't understand that what we're talking about is the beginning of an energy crisis, resource crisis, that is so large in scope that you cannot expect to maintain your level of life and your quality of life just by having this sort of economic one-off help or support from the government. So this is again what we have to understand as a context, even as architects, when we do want to change our practice and even take the opportunity of what all those bright Green New Deals are offering in terms of capacity of innovation and the possibility to actually reshape the field. And for that, for me, one central chapter of that book is this idea of thinking like a building, which I picked up from a philosopher called Stephen Vogel that is reading Aldo Leopold's classic book of Thinking as a Forest, Thinking like a Forest, and bringing that back to the built environment. Just to say that the problem, one of the problems here is the fact, and I think that went through most of these courses along these days, it's the fact that we still consider nature as something outside of what we do, something that can be integrated, that can be interacted with, that can be related with, but something that is external to us and something that we are working against. So, of course, we have to understand that what we do as hands is part of nature. And there is no original nature untouched by man. Everything is touched by us. But now we have to understand that our buildings are also part of that nature. And therefore, that's why they cannot be passive or just zero net. No, they have to do much more than that. They will have to produce towards nature. They will have to give back to nature. As fortunately, we have heard from many people around these round tables along these days. So, of course, that's where we talk about design for the interspecies, or where we talk about forest towers with their problems, but also with their role models for change, and making people more aware that these are at least some small contributions towards that major change. I actually thought it was amazing that very recently a bank in Portugal used this building to show what transformation could happen, collective transformation that could happen in the near future, by showing a sort of corporate building being stripped off and revealing this building as an idea, a metaphor for collective will over the next few years. And I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. That an image from the world of architecture is producing that sort of impact in the commercial banking world is quite surprising. And of course, part of what I was saying earlier, the impact in our lives of what is happening relates also to degrowth, to the idea that actually we have to consume less. That's what we've been discussing here. Before we even produce for consumption, we have to think how to consume less and how to operate in cities also to produce a culture of degrowth. And this is like anathema in American culture, because economically it has been driven by consumption since the beginning of the 20th century, and that's where things become more radical in terms of the need for change. So I think, unlike the international style, it's not going to be about one style or one way of doing. It's going to be about these 1,000 pathways that we have precisely seen in this biennial. Hundreds of small solutions that, if they pass on to the market, if they upscale to large quantities of production of the built environment, then they can be significant and they can be important. So there are a few examples which I invite you to see in the book, also involving biophilic, urban farms, many of the projects that we've discussed here, turning facades into productive and negative emission production mechanisms, the projects by YAG that were mentioned already here, but also an exchange of information and knowledge between North and South. Because, as we know, there is also a lot of climate injustice. And we have to share this knowledge that we're discussing here in a totally white auditorium with the people that need this information and this knowledge first. So really, we have to start moving these ideas onto the places where they are needed immediately, because we still have maybe 20 or 30 years ahead of us before we need them desperately in action to respond to those problems. So now is the time. This is the famous graph that scientists are afraid of, the Oki graph, in which almost every graphic that appears over the latest few years about, carbon emissions, temperatures, all the graphs look like these. Over the last 50 years, they have shot up, and we have a big problem in our hands to now correct that line, or at least to plateau it for the next 100 years. So this is also about individual responsibility. I do believe that if each of us does the little thing that is possible in their fields to change their action before climate, if we all do it at the same time, then maybe we'll achieve something. For me, writing that book was my first responsibility and task. Second is regenerating this farm, since we are in a panel about farms. And so it was thinking about the water systems first, thinking about self-sufficiency, and in terms of energy, in terms of food, and maybe in a sort of a proper way, making sure that in 5 to 10 years I have food and energy sufficient to keep me living there. But of course, as we heard in the panel before, and very well explained, and very well told, of course, this is no solution for the 8 billion people that inhabit the Earth. I mean, it's not going to be in this way. So we have to find other ways to make things work. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Oh. Thank you, Pedro. I hope that after these couple of days, not only will maybe we achieve something, but definitely will achieve something. I'd like to welcome our final speakers for this panel. They are Siim and Sille, and they are homegrown here in Estonia. Siim Karo is a designer and a material researcher and co-founder of Minchin. In his Wrong scene.
That's another scene.
Ah. Oh, shit. That's fine. Everything's fine. I'll start with Sille. Everything's fine. Sorry. It's fine. I'm going to get it. So, Sille. Sorry, Siim. I'm so sorry. Sille is a practicing architect and researcher and tutor and co-founder of the Algorithmic Timber and Architecture Research Group at the Estonian Academy of Arts. Am I on the right, Sille? She completed her master's in the University of Applied Arts in Vienna and practiced as a design architect at Morphosis Architects in LA, as well as Coop Immelblau in Vienna. In 2020, she defended her doctoral degree on methodological development of somatic modularity for algorithmic timber architecture. And Siim Tuksam is a practicing architect researcher at the Estonian Academy of Fine Arts, Faculty of Architecture and co-director of PART. He also co-founded the Algorithmic Timber Architecture Research Group and the Timber Architecture Competence Center, PAC. He has been developing his practice through exhibitions, installations, writings, and architectural projects. At PART, he's been devoted to developing algorithmic tools for the design and delivery of prefabricated structures and the critical discourse of digital architecture. So Sille and the right Siim are enabling the inhabitation of building facades with urban crop pockets. Help me welcome them so that we too can co-inhabit between the farm and the species in cities today.
Hi, everybody. It has been already a very fascinating last few days, so I hope we will continue on that ride and inspire all the students and architects in this space. So what we will discuss today is a Dacia wrap. It's a research project that is somehow started in our office. We are the practicing architecture office in Estonia and has now moved into academic bubble, as Pedro said. But we are in the middle of bursting it, so don't worry. What we are tackling is, of course, the health and humanitarian crisis and questioning how we grow our food, and at the same time questioning the housing crisis, or in that terms trying to find ways how will we live together. And the one topic that Lydia and Areti so nicely made us to question and ask is like, how can we grow food, and what could be the ways of how practicing architects can tackle the terms in the city center. So dachas, the term dacha comes from the Russian term dat, to give, to hand out, and the terminology for dacha is then meaning the land that is given by a prince. Or somebody in charge. This was very common, or still is, a common practice in Estonia, and of course all the Soviet Soviet areas, to hand out land that is approximately 600 square meters, and where is still the food being grown. It also has added to the land is a small hut, a rather primitive one that would then host all the tools and equipment necessary. But of course, with the growth of cities and the growth of capitalism, there's a lot of dacha settlements that has been taken down or moved away. I think the best example of it is near to Tallinn Airport, becoming more international. The airport had to grow, and just recently the last settlement of that nearby Tallinn has been removed, and also with all the surrounding areas of Tallinn. So we are questioning if there's a way to bring those qualities that are there in the small territory of land closer to the citizens, and ask if we can implement that into a building facade.
Hello. I will continue the presentation from the side where it all kind of started, and it's a part of a longer research project that we've been developing called the Slender Project, which is looking at the housing culture in Tallinn. And 100 years ago, people in Tallinn used to live in timber buildings that were actually constructed fast and cheap, and were to house the factory workers that moved into the city. And now we are trying to look how we can once again use a more ecological material to create housing nowadays. And our research is interested in the prefabrication of buildings, so we're closely working together with the Estonian timber house manufacturing industry. So we are trying to bring those ideas into mass production. So how do we tackle mass production? We are very much inspired by this idea of a spatial structure. And spatial structure as a kind of philosophical term, meaning how natural, physical, economic, and political circumstances actually enable reality to be constructed. So we're looking at the ecology of factory-built houses, and what kind of elements concerning structure and fabrication, but also the kind of spatial flexibility should these things be constructed out of. So we have arrived at the method where there's an underlying structure that allows for plugging in different kinds of elements, like floor slabs, structural elements, and that have allowed us to treat the space of the building a lot more flexible, as everything can be rearranged within this grid, But what we're talking about today is actually the outer layer of that building, and how the interior and exterior can also start to intersect and actually become a thick boundary condition that can be inhabited. And Sille will explain the project that we did for the main exhibition now that is about this inhabitation.
So arriving from the slender housing apartment building that it was when we brought it to academia, it became, or it's slowly growing into a research project on communal apartment buildings. And the Taja wrap is actually tackling a specific part of it, the inhabitable facade that is overhanging, that is now allowed according to Estonian laws and standards of construction up to 1 meter. And we were questioning, like, if we could take this 1 meter and insert there alternative routes to get to your apartments or to the rooftop gardens, alternative areas to grow food vertically or again on top of the roof. Also ways of how we communicate to each other or how the community itself gets together and on their vertical streets. Then maybe this could also be a way of aside of producing food, also producing energy for the building. So that's the prototype that we're exhibiting. Let's not call it a prototype, let's call it a mock-up, a 101 mock-up that you see in the Metabolic Home exhibition in Estonian Architecture Museum is actually a cutout, a 3 by 3 meter cutout out of this system. But of course, we went further and really started asking, like, what is the heritage, the historic heritage of housing we have in our country. So 1/3 of Estonians are actually living in Soviet housing blocks. And here we see examples where there's always this firewall that has that sometimes carried some monolithic art pieces, but usually was an empty, often south-facing facade that could have been much nicer to have balconies in this direction. So in any case, we were wondering if this Raumstruktur that Siim was mentioning, or the metagrid, the underlying idea, could give us a possibility to create some kind of circulation on the facade and help to reach the roofs, and also creating possible evacuation staircases for upper apartments, but also inhabiting certain species that could be a possible pick of either the landowners or like the apartment owners in the building, or it could be the community garden for nearby people. And thus doing that, we would be then wrapping it into possible energy producing facade panels or something alternative. So I guess what we are proposing in exhibition is a study on those architectural qualities or those spatial properties that we hope to see on the facade, and the materiality of it, it's still in the process of defining. And that's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello? Yep. Oh, fantastic. So thank you so much, Sille and Siim. Okay. Yes, fantastic. So to start off this roundtable discussion on farm and the species, I wanted to sort of begin with a reflection also in relationship to our previous panel, where in the discussion there was sort of the indication that the farm, in fact, is most of the planet, as well as some of the topics that came up in our panel today. So Jonathan was talking about ecological optima, consilience and convergence, and interoperability. Mitch was telling us that we can, in fact, reduce the impact of rice growing by 45%. Pedro was a little bit worried about the fact that we're keeping it in an academic or research bubble, and you guys just took us through rethinking architecture to host a dacha wrap, which in fact becomes a new form, I guess, of public space in some way. So beyond associating the farm to the city or the farm to species, do we need to refarm the farm? And since I kind of had a sneaky little conversation with my dear friend John about this yesterday, I'm going to pass the mic on to him first.
Okay, that's all right. Thank you very much for that. And I think that, yes, we do need to refarm the farm. Simply put, the methods in which we farm currently are simplistic. We have got better and better and better at more and more efficient at doing single things. When you look at the massive combined harvesters that you see farming with wheat and grains, this is a single species. Species don't work like that. They don't work in singularities. We can force them to do so, and we can use fertilizers to enforce that. But when we look at a forest, you don't need to add fertilizer to a forest to make it grow. It creates its own. So why are we then needing of fertilizer? And this is for me a very strong indicator that we're doing something quite wrong. We're not doing something in an intelligent manner. And if we begin to take our cues from existing ecologies of what might have been before the land use change that creates our farms, we might be able to adapt systems to be much more efficient. And so when I think about computational agroecology and the systems that we might put in place to recreate a farm, that really means dealing with complex abundances of different species. And I think that it's now possible. Honestly, I don't think that this was possible 5 years ago, but I do think that with small, robotic, lightweight, customizable tools, with the affordance of artificial intelligence, species mapping, we can begin to work in a much more complicated environment that changes the nature of the farm and creates a much more diverse crop in a way that is not dependent on fertilizers or petrochemical pesticides or, simply put, diesel to power our massive machines. So yes, I think we need to refarm the farm, but interestingly, a lot of that innovation is happening in cities, which is an odd kind of dichotomy there. So yeah, simply to answer your question, yes, we do.
Thanks, John. Maybe touching up on that sort of the idea of diverse technologies that can be embedded into this refarming of the farm, and engaging actively with technological species in order to do this. I think that maybe Siim and Sille, but also Mitch, you can add through your experiences to how you see this possibility to refarm the farm.
what sprang into my mind when you were talking is we're not just fertilizing crops, we're also fertilizing people by creating those super efficient ways of farming. We are also enabling the population to grow, and the issue has become so much more complex. So is the technology really that advanced that we can take on this very well-worked-in supply chain and well-working system that is enabling us to live the way we live now by using this technology? And also, I think it's a huge issue of scale, the way we farm extensively on huge plots of lands. And it's not just the crops, but also forest. And this is a very hot topic in Estonia, the deforestation, big areas of the forest being cut down for profit. But as we're seeing people moving into the cities, we're also seeing people moving back into the country now with the COVID crisis more and more. And people actually see this deforestation more and more, and they're so much more concerned about it. So I really hope that this technology will help us to also maintain forests in a more kind of organized way, that we don't have to cut down everything and then ship half of it to be burned and use very little of it actually for building timber buildings and creating products and people and things that actually produce value for us.
Yeah, I would actually continue from there, because I think we're in need of actually mapping down the species or the vegetation that could be diversely growing in more dense areas, let's say, that it makes sense to grow in a city center. And then there's, of course, maybe crops that is meant or should be grown in vast lands. So as I think Ep Blancos was today presenting also that most of our food at Soviet times came from this communal farming, but and there were crops and dairy products, but at the same time, for example, the 92% of all the potatoes consumed in Russia are still grown in dachas. So there's certain certain vegetation that should be or could be grown in more dense areas that a 600 square meter per person or like per family is, compared to the vast lands of I don't know, corn and other products. So I think this that would be my interest on also how to continue on the diversity of or how to keep the diversity of edible vegetation in the city, but also understanding that what does not make sense to be brought into urban environments. And I hope that this mapping or understanding the what makes sense is something that we could also continue on our research on.
Yeah, so in some way, not working with a one-size-fits-all answer, of course, but rather customizing, no? Actually, Mitch, you produced an image, which I think was in the New York Times several years ago on the future of New York, yeah? And it was an image that was sort of bringing together lots of different species, technological, ecological, and much more. And so maybe the reflection on how we refarm the farm, I guess in some way that was one of your visions of how we might refarm the farm. How close are we to that, or where do we need to go next?
Yeah, I fully agree with all the presentations, not only from this panel, but from the previous one. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to agree with the keynote, although I don't know. I can't wait for that, yeah. And Jonathan really, just not enough time in 10 minutes to get through some really complex, profound topics. And there's just these words that, describe textbooks of information. So, a simplistic answer to refarming the farm in some ways is it has to do with human population. There's just too many of us, and we've overshot the problem. We've solved it in the most incredible way. Humans have been working on farming for 12,000 years, so we got this tech down, absurdly so. So now it's a matter of, let's look at all the different facets of this issue. And it's in waste. It's in the actual food production, what we cook. It's in air quality issues. It's in water issues. It's certainly in all of the gas issues, the climate issues. So, I don't think there's going to be any one particular answer to it. It's going to be a host of a myriad of solutions that will eventually get us to refarming the farm, because we always have been taking on that problem. I don't think at any point in any culture, in any aspect of humanity, hasn't tried to do just that. It starts from survival, feeding your family, and then eventually gets to mercantilism and prospering as a community, and then helping others, and then globalization. Not necessarily the right direction. When we look at farming, we particularly attacked something that I found one of the biggest problems in a sea of problems is what we do to the animal kingdom. And roughly, we have 13% of wildlife left on the planet. Everything else is a farm animal. So all the animals out there are something that we're basically producing to eat at an enormous capacity. And so much of it is wasteful. That really hit me. And I was thinking, could I change behaviors to start off with that? I'm like, no, I like steak. We had steak last night. I had salmon, but it just tastes too good. And could I reduce it? Yes, I want to. Do I expect everybody to do that, especially in America, for these people who are voting for Trump? No way. As soon as I tell them, or anybody like me, that they have to reduce it, they're going to buy 10 more steaks, eat it, put it on TikTok and say steaks, support American farmers, something like that. So it's a curious problem. Are they going to eat bugs? Well, not right away. But an interesting story in that research is lobsters. Like, no one ate lobsters. Like, just no one in humanity went around and looked at those things and said, oh, that's tasty, let's make a lot of them. We fed them in the United States to prisoners in Maine. It took over 200 years before they became an actual delicacy and a cuisine. Of course, the prisoners didn't tell people how good they tasted. We adapted. So, does it mean we lobster farm? We got a range of weird people that we work with. One of them is Kanye West, who's that guy. And he came to us and he wanted to produce a vertical farm. We've been doing vertical farms since we started with Dixon Despommier at Columbia University. He did the book on vertical farming. So Kanye wanted a vertical farm in LA for his new Donda School, which is a basketball school for kids. And he wanted the farm to produce an entire sushi menu. He got some LA chef. This guy is going to make sushi all within this little, 2-acre plot of land. And he wanted the fish, 4 types of fish, farmed in Los Angeles for the sushi menu. We had Gene Giacomelli, world-renowned expert. He runs the Biosphere 2 project. We had a whole team of consultants, and most of these fish had never been farmed. And there's a Blue Ocean initiative to do more fish farming, because what we do in oceans, we trawl oceans. If you've ever seen Seaspiracy, I shouldn't have had the salmon last night. Actually, it's just unbelievable what we do to wildlife in oceans. So we looked at that problem, and even the basic science isn't there, because people just thought it would be absurd to fish in a desert or a semi-arid climate. And we produced these projects. The result was he just wouldn't take no for an answer. And he wanted everything in there and produced an interesting exercise, and probably never again. So I guess there's a little bit of, I'm on a rant or rambling, so I'll stop there. The problem is, just a library of issues. I think it begins with us. We're going to work not towards one single answer, like a silver bullet. It will be silver buckshot. There'll be many bullets that'll probably tackle this problem, and there's a lot of people working on it, and this conference represents that dialogue.
So I guess Kanye proves that money is the power, as they say in the rap song. I have many music references. And thinking a little bit about that, but also about what John was saying, you know, that natural systems do produce, for example, forests do produce the fertilizer that they need. But Pedro, you were referencing the fact that we are sort of in the face of a fertilizer war, as you were saying. How can we, or how do you foresee that we can overcome or maybe circumnavigate in some way this question of geopolitics, this question of money and power, in order to go back or maybe change or understand how we can get back to the values of the ecological systems, values that are actually embedded into the systems?
I think it gets back to what we've been discussing, which is behavioral change and how we can drive that change, social change. I mean, I started doing composting a few years ago, and now I go to my mother's place and I see that she doesn't do composting, and I get anxious because I think we are losing time in the fact that that compost could actually be fertilizing. I mean, from what we produce in terms of organic waste in cities, it could be fertilizing all the fields, all the agro fields around. And people are taking too much time to move onto those little measures, which will have to be driven by policy. So the EU is now pressing for that policy, but has given all the nations in the European Union 3 years to adapt. Do you think they are adapting right now? No, they will adapt in the last month in which the law comes into place. And this is stupid, because people know already that the problem is there. They know already that they could start working on the problem right now, and they will do it last minute. And so, again, there are psychological arguments that explain why people are like this, or why people feel uncomfortable if we talk about these issues, and they want to resist it and not think about it. I mean, my 13-year-old is very cynical, and he says, you know, humanity has to be wiped out because we have destructed the planet. This is what 13-year-olds are thinking. Humanity has to be wiped out. And I think, well, that's shocking. Take it easy. But, you know, we really have to understand how to pass the message more. And the fact that I was talking about an academic bubble was also in the sense that scientists are now concerned that climate information is not passing in the right way to people. And this is a problem of the science community, because people have to understand the problem and overcome that psychological anxiety and start to deal with it very naturally. I must say, I'm in my optimistic phase right now, because I had my pessimistic phase when I did research for an exhibition, and I read everything about climate change over 6 months, and I understood that, God, I didn't know anything about these. And now that I know, I'm really shocked. And now I'm already at the stage in which I understand that there are pathways, there are technologies which are pointing the way for solutions. But politically and socially, this is where things have to happen, because then people will get used to it and they will find it as a natural part of their lives. And then they will accommodate that change very naturally. Because, I mean, we talked about it here. We do recycling now as a very natural act. But if you go and talk to older people, some people still don't understand why you do it. And how stupid is that? So I think we really have to think more about how to drive behavioral change also from the field of architecture. And there, I do think, and we have discussed this earlier, sometimes clients are the ones that are asking for that change, and architects are actually resisting it because they are too comfortable with the language, the formal languages in which they have built their status quo, and they don't want to, you know, disturb that status quo. And that's problematic. That's what we have to discuss, because we have to overcome that barrier as well, and be open to these other possibilities, which are also opportunities to form making, to aesthetics, everything. Everything is there as a potential for a great creative moment. And that's where I become optimistic.
Well, it's good to hear that you're optimistic. I also feel pretty optimistic most of the time. So, I think that it's interesting because you're talking about behavioral change and people need to overcome. But then on the other side, John was telling us how we should be lazy in order to observe. So maybe it's a different kind of lazy that we need to be, and that too is a behavioral change. And so I guess in some way, to some extent, what we need to shift is maybe our system of values, no? So before Siim was talking about they cut down the forest for profit, but it's an economic profit. So what are the other profits or what are the other values that we can embed into our design practices and sort of, as you were saying, overcome also as designers this discomfort, this change. And in that sense, what would you suggest to younger designers for them to sort of emerge and entice this behavioral change over the coming years? I don't know if anyone wants to take that one.
I can just take it in a very specific respect, which is go out there and try to understand deeply what ecosystem services means and how they are now being considered into law, so that when you do anything, you have to consider what your building or structure or landscape is bringing onto the community and onto the ecosystem, because this is really the answer. We have not valued ecosystem services over the last 20, 30 years, but now lawmakers, policymakers are starting to value those ecosystem services. And so once you have some plot of land or a dacha, and you know that you are also producing and receiving even money from the state because you're producing that ecosystem service, then people will also be stimulated to contribute and to do more in that respect.
I'm going to give you a segue. I want to say something. Sorry. No, I was thinking that it's not only what it brings to the community, but also what it brings to design in itself. And in that sense, you guys are working with sort of materially informed also design. So not just what the design in itself produces, but also what the intelligence embedded within the materials that you work with allow that design to produce through a series of parametric or other design tools. So you can say what you were going to say now.
I was going to say, it's fascinating actually to see how this summer houses actually use laziness, or you're allowed to have a vacation, and then on your vacation, what you did, you produced food for yourself, and you built the house, and actually it created more work that kind of cultivated a way of living. So in a way, it's about reframing how we make these behaviors attractive. And in that sense, I think aesthetics is also a big part of it, and form, and how people kind of perceive those things that are coming into the city. At the moment, there's a lot of talk about we need to not mow the lawn that much so that more species can have a life in the city. But at the same time, we have headlines, "I was bitten by a snake in the city." And that's just, we can't have that. I mean, we need to mow the lawn again. But if this becomes desirable for the people, if they see that it works, it's aesthetically pleasing, it's a way of getting out of the house and meeting people, growing yourself something, and having a nice leisure time that is active at the same time, then it could bring about a difference in behavior.
I see a lot of potential for architecture to be an educational tool that is directing the change of behavior. And in I think in that term, what you were asking, like how we are trying to do that with shifting materials in the interiors of spaces, or showcasing the fact that that this building is built out of timber by taking away the interior finish and leaving the structure of the building there. So in that terms, like avoiding. So that's why I like architecture as an educational tool that is not screaming into your face, do that, go there, turn around, do this, but it's much more of hinting and directing into possible new futures. So instead of your mom telling you what to do, it's actually like her letting a lot of freedom of you're finding your own way. And I think that's why our field of expertise is really good. It's not through words and ways of saying, but it's through directing towards the change.
You know, I'm going to address the "what do you tell the students" thing. So the first thing I tell students, is 2 words: question authority, which basically means me and anybody else who's teaching you. Which is okay. It doesn't say, kill them, although I think killing your father and mother is also a part of that lesson somewhere along the line. I had to do that to like Frank Gehry and Zaha, who I completely loved, and then realized that's not the kind of architecture I want to do whatsoever. And I have been doing the interspecies thing for, I don't know, almost 25 plus years. I've been doing engineered living materials and biofabricated structures and adaptive reuse and social justice-based projects as soon as I heard those terms. And I think we've got 100 more years of those terms. But I expect my students to just finish me off, get to the next level. I mean, I look at Greta Thunberg, and she sits there in front of the world leaders and says blah, blah, blah to a bunch of older people. I'm an older person now, and I've been doing this forever. We didn't solve it. So for the students, it's, wow, pull out your knives, get some blood. I mean, we have like 5 years left, according to the United Nations. You're going to inherit this shitstorm. I'll be around, but I've had a good life so far. I have kids, that worries me. So I think that's really the base of it, is maybe more experimental, more radical. Think of new heroes, think of new paradigms. We've got to get there. The pandemic was this kind of shift, and we're out of it. I don't know. It's a time for flourishing. But the level of radicality has got to get to that next level. That's just my thought. There'll always be others who have different opinions, and I do respect them. It's not that I don't respect Gehry or how they build desire into those forms, and you can learn from that. But this is titanium, and institutions like that are not necessarily going to get us out of this particular issue. They've got to be also rethought.
If I can sort of talk also across generations, but again across this sort of rural-city divide. It's very interesting for me. I grew up in London. I know I don't sound like that, do you know what I mean? But I did. My mum was teaching primary school kids for 20 years. She won awards doing that. And most of those kids had never been outside of the city. All they knew about anything that was growing and green was what they found in the park, And some of them had never been to the coast, and they'd never seen a forest. And these kids, this is what they know. And so when we're talking about cognizance, we're talking about what we can do next. We need to be aware of how interconnected we are with natural systems, food systems, and that we are not separate from nature, we are a part of it. And we can't do that unless we have the opportunity to be cognizant of what nature is. And I think in that sense, in a sort of intergenerational way, but also in a spatial way, the blurring of the boundaries, that creating environments, ecological environments within cities, but then also outside those cities, changing the nature of how we live. The village that I'm in, I'm very positive about this now, but the village that I'm in has 700 inhabitants. Now that is split between people over 70, nobody in the middle, and then a whole bunch of youngsters. And I'm now in the middle with a lot of people who are coming back to these rural environments. And the kids are engaging with these incomers, these immigrants into rural places. And they're interested not in what their grandparents are saying about farming with tractors. They're interested in Arduinos. They're interested in microscopes. They're interested in new things. And so sort of this blurring of the boundaries of cognizance, I think, is greatly afforded by bringing farms or ecology into cities, but also the cities back into the farms with different types of ideas.
So we have a sneaky 2 minutes, and I wanted to ask if anyone from the audience had a pressing question they'd like to address. Yes, we have one in the front.
Hi, just a quick question about the time scales. As you, multiple of you said, we are in a really hurry, but traditionally architectural processes are really slow. And especially if you are trying to move towards engaging all the stakeholders, the communities, it gets even slower. So is the speeding up of architectural processes then a radically important thing that we should focus on?
Yeah, it's a slow medium. It's a resistant medium. And therefore, it's difficult to conceive of these type of changes. But I do think that at the same time, there's, as Mitch was just saying, there has been a lot of research already. The question is passing that research onto a more practical professional field and welcome it into a professional field, which I think will be possible within, by pressure, and the need even of builders and other elements in society to incorporate these ideas. So I do think that we have already produced the kind of knowledge that can be put into motion when it's needed. But as I say again, yes, we have to reconceive lots of aspects of how we consider architecture, including this idea that just being durable it equals sustainability, which is not true anymore. And so you have to rethink really how you operate within architecture to respond to that sort of problem in a different way.
Thanks.
Thank you. Oh. You have 2 seconds.
Oh, finish. So much of the research that we have been developing in the last 10 years about ecology has been developed in a perspective of like energy abundance. I mean, we were speaking about ecology and the impact, but from the perspective, at least from the first word, of energy abundance. Here now in Europe, we are facing for the first time, from one day to another, a scenario of energy scarcity. And this is bringing with it like a poverty in general of the people. The price of the food is increasing because the energy, because of the processing of the food is energy demanding, so when it rises. So which would you think will be the impact on our research of the energy scarcity, and how much of the research that we have been developing until now we can bring to the next phase in the case of a scenario of energy scarcity? And this I would like to ask to Joachim and Pedro from a more practice perspective and from a more academic perspective.
Pedro and I had a great conversation before. I'll try and bring in a little bit of that. And I agree what he had just said, which is an energy answer. There are libraries of Civilization 2.0 in most major universities with incredible projects, innovations, ideas, and actually provable engineering to get us to a fully self-reliant, self-sufficient system when it comes to energy. Probably 50 years of really good research that's there, collecting dust in libraries. Recently, I mean a couple of days ago, MIT, love MIT, nailed it, sat away, creates a battery out of sand, sulfur, and salt. better than lithium ion, supposedly, doesn't explode, doesn't get too hot, anyone could make it, you don't have to get it from rare earth metals in China, you don't have to go get cobalt someplace in Africa, we can make the stuff here, it's amazing and it's astounding. About 5 people no one likes my posts anymore, but no one seems to care. This should be major news. I don't need to, well, there's a lot of stuff in the news that we don't need to learn about. This is yet another game changer. Just last month, Time Magazine, energy was a whole issue on energy, and this came from harvesting turbine systems beneath waves as far better than wind, far better than solar, geothermal, biomass, readily available, proven, 10 years, certainly scalable. The reason with energy that we have a problem with energy, amongst many other problems, is something we call predatory delay. Those are those big companies that support these cool projects. Say, well, I love your solar panels, something, dacha building. I don't know if there were solar panels in it. I love your building. Don't do too many of them. Here's some money. Keep doing the research, throw it in the library. Keep it in the ivory tower. Because every single day, these energy companies stay in business. They're making trillions of dollars in profit. So it's okay from a public relations perspective to support these new inventions and concepts, to give them some money, but not to let them overtake the system. Predatory delay is about the speed. It's something we need to fight, and it's hard to fight because they're not disagreeing with you. They're just sort of slowing it down. So, it's quite a monster.
I'm sorry, we're going to have
just to finish, one potential perverse effect of the war is the fact that it's pushing the EU to really go into renewables, because the things are there. And they haven't moved because of economical lobbying, which prevents us to move onto that field. So maybe the war can actually have a positive effect of pushing people onto renewables. And then, not to speak about these high-tech solutions, I mean, for me in the farm, what's been interesting is thinking through systems that are almost crafts and just hands-on, which is thinking of solar panels to bring the water up the hill so that by night the water comes down, micro turbines and so on, and produces the energy constantly. And so there are many solutions, again, to make you self-sustainable in terms of energy and solve part of the problems. The food problem is actually much more difficult than that of energy at this point, because we have to feed 8 billion people.
And on that note, unfortunately, to the gentleman who had a question, you will have to save it for later. I think what we need to do is be creative, be experimental, be positive, and don't be scared to co-inhabit, co-design, and co-produce with all of our species. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thank you very much to the audience for your attention. Please feel free to hound the people on stage down to ask your questions afterwards, and on to the next subject.